Hi, I'm James Verdeer, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, we're joined by Dr. Rob Dunn, Senior Vice Provost of Interdisciplinary Programs at North Carolina State University, and Dr. Pia Sörensen, a chemical biologist and head of the Science and Cooking program at Harvard University, where she teaches almost 1 million students a year about science and cooking. They join me to talk today about their BioScience article, Nature Chefs, Uniting the Hidden Diversity of Food Making and Preparing Species Across the Tree of Life. As you might expect, our conversation was focused on food and the species that create it, including humans, and the evolutionary and ecological implications of food and food making. It was a fun and very far-ranging discussion, so with no further ado, let's go to the interview. Thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to be on the show.
Excited to be here.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Nature Chefs, and I thought just to get us started for our listeners, it would be helpful to know exactly what that term means in this context. So I'll leave it to either of you. Go right ahead and tell us what that's about.
Well, so a number of us that were authors in this paper were at a meeting a while ago now in Copenhagen that focused on taste. And as part of that meeting, I was presenting about it was all sorts of scientists and chefs and scholars from many different angles thinking about taste. And I was sort of the evolutionary ecologist in the group. And so as part of my talk, I was talking about fruits and the flavor of fruits, and kind of in an offhanded way happened to mention that of course fruits evolved so as to cater to animals that eat them and then disperse their seeds. And at that moment, or slightly later in the talk, one of the chefs stood up and said, do you mean to say that fruits are nature's chefs? And there was a little more elaboration on the sentence, but that was the take home. And it was this amazing moment, because on the one hand, it was, for me as a biologist, it was fascinating because it meant that the chef wasn't thinking about the fact that fruits evolved so as to play this role in nature, that fruits evolved to be food for other animals. And so that was news for the chef, was interesting for me. But the other piece that was so interesting was this formulation of nature's chefs. And as we started to talk about it in the group, and Pia was there, and Nabila, who's also on the paper, was there. Josh Evans was there. It became clear that this was, for biologists, actually a new formulation. This idea that there are species that are in nature, they have evolved so as to cater to the senses of other species and please them to achieve their evolutionary ends. And that was a really fun idea. And so it got it to start exploring, well, what does this mean? How do you think about it? And how do you think about this in a way that brings in the perspectives of chefs and physicists and ecologists and all the sorts of people that we think are fun to have around the table? And so that's how it sort of started.
Yeah, and I think one thing I would add to that was that I think the very fact that it was already a very interdisciplinary meeting, so there were chefs there, researchers, food scientists, philosophers, humanists, and everyone who kind of was there was really excited by the idea. And so it just seemed like it was touching on something that kind of brought us together, that we could talk about and bring our different perspectives to kind of think in a different way about our fields.
And we owe that in big part to Ulla Moritzen, who's an amazing physicist turned culinary physicist, for lack of a better term, who has gathered during his career just an amazing group of people who think food is fascinating and wonderful and cool and a useful way to spend your life work. And so that was the room. It was people Ulla thought were interesting to gather to think about taste. And so this was one of the ideas that came out of that room, but there were many.
Yeah. Ulla is amazing for bringing that together. I think one thing that really sort of caught my interest with this was, so I teach science with food. I teach physics and chemistry with food. And one of the things I always try to tell my students is that when chefs cook, or when you cook in your kitchen, you are essentially manipulating all these biological materials. You're turning them into something that you may not want to eat, into something that you do want to eat. And to do that, you kind of have certain materials at your disposal, and you have a wide variety of techniques and processes at your disposal as well. And so I think what's striking about this nature's chefs idea is that when the sort of evolutionary selective pressures has a lot of those same materials to work with, right? And some of the kind of tricks and manipulations available are the same. And so there's sort of this underlying science that is used by human chefs, but that is also available to nature's chefs.
Pia, do you want to give an example of one of those sort of commonalities?
So can I take an example from the paper, which I love? So yes, anyone nodding? Yes.
Yes.
So one kind of key thing that chefs do is they want to manipulate the viscosity of fluids. A common way to do it is to make various sauces. So you want a sauce that is, let's say you're making a mac and cheese sauce, you want it to be thick enough to cling to your food. And sometimes if you're making more of a soup, you want it to be thin enough so that it's kind of nice and slurpy and has that watery slurp to it. And there are kind of parallels in all of cooking through this. So if you're into pastry baking, then you know that you can manipulate the viscosity of sugar by boiling it, and then the sugar solution becomes thicker and thicker. So for example, when you make maple syrup from tree sap, part of the process is to slowly boil it down and reduce it so that you get a thicker syrup that clings to your pancakes that you can kind of scoop up and eat with your food. So there is a parallel with this in nectar, which I would never have. This is an example of something I would have never known if I had not talked with this group of people, where essentially birds. So let's see if I get this right. So there are flowers that have a higher nectar content, a higher sugar content in their nectar, something like 35%, and those tend to cater to insects that kind of dip their tongue and kind of scoop up the nectar that way. And then on the other hand, birds and butterflies who would kind of suck up the liquid, they tend to then feed on flowers that have a lower sugar content in their nectar. And so a higher sugar content means more viscous, and a lower sugar content means less viscous. And so this is an example of how nature is essentially using that same idea of how you can manipulate the viscosity simply by having more or less sugar in a fluid, and kind of reaching the goal that is your goal as the nature chef.
Yeah, and I think, for me, one of the challenges to thinking about these ideas is that, of course, a human chef is bringing consciousness into this decision making, and natural selection is this unconscious process that favors things that work given the conditions, and yet they're both responding to the palates of organisms and to the biophysics of how organisms eat, the details of their tongues and noses and even their visual systems. And so through processes that are a little bit different, one more conscious and one much more about natural selection, you get these very similar responses. And then sometimes you get different responses, and that's interesting too. And for me, that's a really interesting juxtaposition, and it allows this back and forth. And so you think about, well, what can chefs learn from what's happening in nectar or what's happening with fruit, and then vice versa. What can we learn about new ways to study nectar or fruit through thinking like a chef or thinking like a physicist who works with chefs like Pia. And then for me, one of the other really fun things has been that as evolutionary biologists and ecologists, these instances of nature chefs have been thought about in different fields separately. And so the people who study fruit might talk to the people who study nectar because they know them personally. They go to they meet up at a bar, but they're not studying those two systems in close collaboration. And they're certainly not studying them in collaboration with the insects that produce food for their mates, or the mussels, the freshwater mussels that produce false food to attract fish to eat the mussels. And so this concept sort of allows us to start to look across these different systems at this phenomenon that we hadn't realized was part of this greater whole. And so I think it's going to open up all sorts of new questions. And that for me is a really fun part. And then there are things that, that human chefs do that nature chefs, I mean, human chefs are one of nature's chefs, but the human chefs do that non-human nature chefs don't seem to do. And then those become interesting too. And so it opens up all these questions. And that for me is one of my favorite parts of the conversations that have resulted here.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested to key in on the idea that, this sort of gives us a new lens for looking at all of these questions, within nature. It's traditionally, as you mentioned, you would have people kind of focused on a relatively narrow area of evolution, say, whereas this kind of gives us the ability to, look at production of food or food mimics as its own thing, as a field or a subfield in its own right. Is that kind of what's at work here?
Yeah, and Pia and I and the rest of the team have seen this in the collaboration. And so we started with a small group that emerged from that meeting, and then we pulled in other people. And so, for example, Brad Taylor, who's an aquatic ecologist, became a really key part of this, coordinating this effort and thinking about these ideas. And Brad brought in all these examples from nature chefs and aquatic ecosystems that we didn't know about, that the rest of the people in the conversation weren't even aware of. And so I think bringing this community together has allowed us to have this bigger vision. And then I think having the human chefs and or people who think about human chefs along with the ecologists and evolutionary biologists, it's also shown us some of these little weird intricacies. And so one that I really like is that if you think about human chefs, a lot of what human chefs try to do is to create foods that either are meat or are relatively meaty. And so, a lot of the great work of human chefs focuses on meat. But then you also have things like stinky fermented tofu or washed rind cheeses that become meaty in terms of their aroma profiles and even their texture. And so then one of the questions, if you turn back to nature chefs, is, well, where do we see that in nature? And it turns out it doesn't seem to be very common. That for example, very few fruits seem to be meaty. And then that opens up this new question. Well, why aren't there more fruits that are meaty? What's going on there that's not evolved more often? And it seems to have, two partial answers right now. And I think, we'll keep exploring it. And one seems to be that, maybe that's an expensive kind of food to produce for plants. Another may be that meat eaters might not be very good service providers for plants. That the meat eaters tend to be rare. Think about a tiger. There aren't many tigers in a place, and so they're not maybe very reliable dispersers. But then the other thing we realized is that there are actually some cases where the plants produce relatively meaty fruits that smell a little bit more animalian. And so something like that is really intriguing evolutionarily. But if we reconnect it with the human chefs, it's also potentially interesting in an applied way, because if we can figure out how some of those meaty fruits produce meaty aromas, meaty flavors, and attract carnivores, we can actually co-opt some of those insights to make fake meats more meat-like in a way that maybe is relatively cheap and sustainable. And so there's this openness, this coming together across disciplines, and this interplay that I think offers opportunity. I don't know, Pia, did you have more thoughts on that, or more succinct thoughts than my rambling?
No, I think that's a great summary of an example where that interplay is just such an invitation to innovation. And I think there are so many examples. There's this example of jackfruit, which has a very, very meaty texture. In fact, it's a common meat substitute that's actually on the market, and that actually does cater to carnivores, which is another one of those kind of strange example where the two main components of food, flavor and texture, are so important, and that is an example of where the texture really plays an important role, I think. The other thought I have about this is the interesting interplay that happens between what a chef, whether it's a human chef or a nature chef, what they want to produce and what they have available to them. So a human chef is going to be limited by the ingredients that are available, and similarly, a nature chef is going to be limited by the kind of stoichiometry that's there in the environment. So nitrogen, for example, is rare, and so as a nature's chef who wants to produce food with nitrogen, they have to balance their own nitrogen needs with what they could produce. And there's this parallel to nature's chef, especially kind of haute cuisine and modernist chefs who tend to constantly be innovating and exploring and being creative. It's a very common thing for them to impose some kind of restriction on their creativity. So there are some examples of this from Virgilio Martinez in Peru, who will only cook things from certain altitudes within Peru, or within the Nordic cuisine movement, where if you want acidity in a dish, maybe you would not include lemon because it's not a local ingredient. Maybe you would instead go to gooseberries or some other local ingredient. And by doing that, they're kind of pushing their creative boundaries. And I think in similar ways, some of those restrictions and the kind of sort of nature's chef creativity is also related to these restrictions in the environment for nature's chefs.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating parallel that I enjoyed reading about in the paper. I'm hoping we could talk a little bit about some of the different ways in which nature's chefs produce food or produce fake food. What are sort of the general approaches that nature tends to take? I note that you cite them as three broad categories: food, drink, and lures, within the subsections of real meals and mimics. So I'm kind of wondering, just broadly speaking, what sorts of categories exist among those three, and what sorts of examples do we see within them?
So in general, to sort of bring back those themes, I mean, we think about nature chefs offering food, we think about nature chefs offering drinks, and then lures. And so the foods are things like fruit or insects, and this is for insect people, this is so obvious, like who doesn't know about this? But in many insects, when insects are mating, the male offers a little food reward to the female. And so that's actually a food in the same way that a fruit is. The evolutionary dynamics are slightly different, but it's very fruit-like. And so that's another food item. For drinks, we have things like nectar, but nectar can take many forms. And then for lures, there are many, many kinds of lures in nature, which in general is a category of foods that attract something to eat, but then have tricked that consumer in some way or another. And there's a rich diversity in the kinds of trickery that is involved there. And I think if we revisit this in 10 years, our categorizations will shift and expand. But in terms of where we are now and thinking about these things, that was a good first rough cut. And each of those is a little bit different in terms of which senses they appeal to and how they do it. And so, fruits very often have to attract an animal consumer first from a relatively far distance. And so imagine you're trying to attract a primate that's going through the canopy and has to spot you. And so there are visual cues. And then there are intermediate distance olfactory cues. And then the fruit also has to reward the consumer with taste and flavor cues, which are these are taste receptors, the aromas that go into the back of the nose, it's mouthfeel, it's all those pieces. And so that's that food category, which gets complex and wonderful. And then the drink category, often the drink, which the most common case is nectar, is relatively simple, but very often the organism that's providing the drink has evolved complex ways to signal that the drink is there and to reward the senses of the animal that's looking for a drink. And so, the existence of flowers is really that reward system. And we've debated in our group: are they more like billboards? Is it more like plating food? Like what exactly is the flower relative to the drink and the nature chef context? And we'll continue to debate, but it's something in that its sphere. It attracts the organism, but it also enhances the experience when the organism is drinking the nectar and makes the organism more likely to get there and drink. And so that's that sort of drink realm. And then the lures, we have a pretty good diversity of lures in the paper, but I suspect when people read the paper, we'll immediately get emails of, well, why didn't you include this lure that everybody knows about from this species that only lives at high elevations and at the eastern end of Nepal. But the lures that we see include animals that use their tongues to lure other species and then eat them. They include animals that use their tails to lure other species and eat them. They include mussels that produce things that look like fish or look like other prey items, so that fish go near enough to the mussel that the mussel can then release its eggs into the fish, where they then undergo their next life stage. And so that's a different sort of realm. And I think what's useful about the categories is that how an organism appeals to its consumer seems to be slightly different in those different categories.
That's perfect. And one thing that particularly caught my eye was the discussion of problem diners and the way that one can draw a parallel between human chefs or restaurants and something taking place in the natural world. One of the examples referred to, the ways that fruit making plants might, for instance, want to produce satiety, within their consumers. I assume so that they would move on, and how that might be similar to, the way that a restaurant might serve food that could be, eaten quickly or something like that. So I was hoping we could talk a little bit more about that and the ways that the food that's produced can have an influence on the behaviors of the consumers.
Yeah, that's a great question. Pia, you want to start us off?
I mean, I think there's so many examples in the food industry, for starters, right, where all kinds of things are done to attract our attention or to just make the food look bigger or better or more colorful, and everything from adding air to ice cream or to bread or to adding color, adjusting the light. And so I think there's so many parallels to that. And then I think there are all these interesting ways in which, and this may be a little bit off topic in a way, but there are all these interesting ways in which modernist chefs play with those expectations. So a modernist chef may produce, so one of my favorite examples is this little crab apple at Mugarit's restaurant in Spain, which has been coated with rhizopus. So it looks like a perfectly moldy apple and nothing you would ever eat. But it's perfectly safe and it's delicious, and it's intentionally there to play with our perception of what is edible and what is not, and kind of to play with that boundary. Do you want to continue with some of the other examples, Rob?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think that's also a good example of there are these cases that emerge in haute cuisine that we don't see great examples of in nature, but it's also possible we're not, nature is infinitely dimensional, and so that's maybe that we just didn't bring the right person to the team yet, and so that example of revulsion, and the extent to which some chefs are really playing with different emotions, and so there are a number of restaurants now where you go and part of your experience is to feel uncomfortable or disgusted. And I can't, I mean, we don't have any examples, and I can't think of examples where nature chefs are doing that. And so, there are these interesting things that become different. But that manipulation, if we step back to the broader idea, is really common. And And so, fruits that want to convince animals that are eating them that they're full, and that from a fruit's perspective, that's very advantageous, because if you stay in a tree all day and you just keep eating the fruits, well, you're going to deposit the seeds of the fruit right under the same tree. And they're going to have the same fate as if they were never dispersed in the first place. And so for the tree, there's selective pressure favoring evolutionary innovation that makes the animal go farther. Or, a really great example of this is mistletoes. And so mistletoe fruits, they've evolved mistletoe plants grow on other trees. They're parasitic. And from a dispersal perspective, that's really tricky, because you have to get from one tree to another tree. But most of the time, birds poop out seeds under the ground. And if they land on the ground, they die. Well, mistletoes have evolved this amazing adaptation where the coating of the seed is sticky and slimy. And so when the bird poops out the seed, it has to use its foot to kind of scrape the seed off of its backside. And the best way to do that is for it to be on a branch. And so it ends up scraping the seed off onto the branch. And so that's a really intricate manipulation of consumer behavior, and I hope that there aren't any human chefs right now that are trying to manipulate this subsequent bathroom behavior of consumers. But who knows? The chef world's a big world with lots going on. But there's a lot of evolutionary innovation in that space, and sometimes fruits and other nature chefs are also trying to convince some species not to come to the table. And so there are quite a few fruits that are palatable and delicious for the intended consumer, but unpalatable or bad tasting, or even dangerous for other consumers. And so the biology of mammals and birds is different enough that if a fruit wants to cater to birds, it simultaneously can use biochemistry to make itself less attractive to mammals and vice versa.
A great example of that is capsaicin, which is the spicy molecule in chili peppers. So there is this idea that capsaicin may have evolved as a way to deter rodents from eating them. And birds eat them just fine. They're not susceptible to that spiciness at all.
And to layer back on top of that, when a human chef then experiments with chili peppers, they're kind of doing artwork on top of that evolutionary story. They're playing with the perceived danger of the chili. They're playing with that pain sensation, and so they're engaging that evolutionary story. Often unknowingly. And so there's this kind of layering of these two aspects to the world of food that I think is really intriguing. And then I hope that there are chefs that find this paper useful in that way, that it allows them some new contexts in which to think about that interplay between the biology of the world around them and what they're offering to humans.
And I guess that leads me to a question then about, perhaps what's up with us that we like to eat these capsaicin-bearing, fruits. What do we know why people like them? And do other animals that are capable of experiencing the burn of a chili, do they enjoy them, or is it pretty much an effective deterrent for mammalian species except people?
So there's work on this by psychologists, and there's work on this by evolutionary biologists. And what the psychologists have shown is that most other mammals just won't eat chili peppers. There's a report in the one study of a dog named Moose, and I can remember the name of the dog, but not the scientist suddenly. And Moose, this individual dog, seemed to have learned to like chili peppers. And so there are these cases, but in general, dogs don't. If I have more difficulty learning to like chili peppers unless they really see their owner appreciating them. And so there's this learning piece. Chimps can learn to like chili peppers if they see humans eat them, and if there's this sort of learning component. And so there are some species that seem to be able to conditionally learn to like them. But I would say that the two going hypotheses with humans, one is that historically the chili peppers offered this additional role of a little bit of pathogen control in foods that were left out for a long time, and there is evidence that they can help control pathogens. And so you can leave if you go to Central America and you see a jar of great looking sauce that's open and has been on the table for 6 months, it's probably still okay to use because the chilies, and often the lime and salt together are pretty good deterrents to some foodborne illnesses. But then the other idea is it's a little bit like going to a scary movie, that we get a little bit of an endorphin pump from the experience of something that's like pain, but is not actually posing us a real danger. And so maybe part of it's just a creepy feature of the human brain in a modern context.
Right. And I think one of the interesting things here that we're talking about is that, the human responses to, food is like largely aesthetic in a lot of ways. We appreciate complexities about, the food and the presentation, the way it appears, the way it tastes, the mouthfeel, et cetera. Do we have any reason to believe that, animals other than humans are experiencing food in sort of the same ways, or do we have any insights into, how they perceive these things that are, that are being prepared for them?
Well, I'll go quickly, and I know I just went on, so I'll try to be pithy. But so Monica Sanchez and I wrote a book about this, about deliciousness across species, and what we argue, and Pia and I have talked about this a lot, is that the senses of animals in general that relate to eating are all relating to rewarding the consumption of some things and penalizing the consumption of others. And so our taste receptors associated with pleasure are also associated with pleasure in other animals. And so there's no reason to think that when other animals are making those choices, that it's not associated with pleasurable outcomes for those animals. And in fact, we see lots of evidence that, for example, chimps will eat lots of foods that taste good to them, but are not necessarily healthy and don't necessarily represent a good energy expenditure. And so I think, as you look across animals, my own perspective would be that in general, when they eat, they're trying to find delicious things. And typically those so happen to also provide what they need in terms of nutrition. But what they're trying to do first and foremost is use their senses to judge delicious versus non-delicious. I don't know. Pia, what do you think? Do you buy this frame?
I think it's a very interesting frame to think about. And some of the examples that come to mind are these examples of cats who continue to hunt even after they're full. And there's a great dolphin example as well that I can't remember the details of now. But I think there are some indications of this that would be really great to look into more. Very, very cool to think about. Good question.
Yeah, and that leads me to an obvious next question, which is, what sorts of areas would the two of you like to see studied next? What sorts of things might offer us the greatest possible insights into, the ways that nature is preparing foods for itself, or humans are preparing food for each other?
But one of the things I was fascinated by, and I had no idea this was the case, was how when we think about cooking, we so often think about using heat. Right. And of course, there are many, many other things that are involved when we cook all kinds of food preparations, but that is often the kind of go-to definition. And I had no idea that heat also serves a role within nature's chefs. There are some examples of flowers producing heat. There are some examples of bees that generate heat, and that helps the lactic acid fermentation of their honey and pollen mixture. And so this idea that the sort of looking at the techniques that are common in human cooking and looking at finding further examples in nature and exploring how that really works and the effect that has. I think there's a lot of potential there for really interesting discoveries.
Yeah, Pia's examples are great ones, and I think if you ask the different authors of the paper, we'd all have favorite things that lead off in different directions. For me, I'm really interested in the idea that many different animals seem to employ fermentation and modifying their food, which is sort of an angle on this Nature Chef concept, but to think about the ways in which they're employing techniques to curate that fermentation. And so in the Pia's example, the bees are fermenting in some cases pollen, in other cases nectar. There are ants that employ fermentation. Hyenas will hide their food in a way that looks like it's actually curing in some cases. And so I think that processing of the food by some animals is a really interesting feature of this too. And to what extent is some of that processing producing outcomes that taste better? Which is kind of a footnote to the paper, but it's an interesting piece. I also think the meaty fruits is, for me, a really intriguing case, and I'd love to personally study those a little bit more and see what's going on there.
Yeah, and I would add to this, I would love to see what chefs would do with this, because I can see them reading this and learning about this and just being really inspired by the possibilities within the culinary world. So we should talk to some of the people on the team, but also I'd love to hear what people's response to this is when they hear it, and I hope we'll get some ideas for other things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like, there will be perhaps future developments to hear from, both within the academic literature and also maybe even within restaurants. I should warn our listeners, we've only scratched the surface here today, but that's, of course, all you can do in the context of a podcast. I encourage everyone to go and read the article. It's fascinating with many, many great examples and quite a lot to learn. I'd like to thank you both very much for joining me today. It's been great.
It was such a pleasure. It was great to give you a taste.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you